Hey everybody, welcome back to the Making Space podcast. As you know, this is a conversation for all of us as leaders and those who love the local church, exploring how physical spaces, both within our churches and outside of our churches, have an impact and an influence on how we're being formed into Christ-likeness, on our emotions, our thoughts, and our behavior. I am Jay Kim, and I am, of course, as always, here with my friend and co-host, Benjamin Wendell. Benjamin, how are you, man?
I'm doing great. And Jay, I know you're going to introduce our guest in just a minute, but I want to get in early and say she's fantastic. This is going to be a great episode. How's San Francisco today?
Sunny, as always. Yeah, sunny and warm. How is it down under?
Well, down under is a bit rainy, but I was in Boston this week and wow, the red brick buildings and the architecture. My first time there, something pretty special. And you know what? I was thinking about this podcast because it really is quite amazing how physical design somehow really captures the culture of a city. You see it, you feel it. And I think that's what we're talking about. It's the same with our churches, our homes, our leadership environments. Design and space speaks to us in quite profound ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, can't wait to dig in. Give us a little bit of the overview here, Benjamin, about just the podcast in general. Maybe some folks are jumping in for the first time.
Well, I love what we are covering in this podcast. The team up of Aspen and Barna is a total win. It's a super interesting subject. For me, I've been a pastor for 20 years, just on multiple levels. And the research that we're looking at dives into physical spaces and how they play into our spiritual formation. And so I think if you're a pastor or a leader, this subject has implications. Why? Because we're so often involved in having a key role in influencing and shaping our physical environment. So be that churches, facilities, or beyond, or how we engage with the community. And I think it is it starts a great conversation, hopefully within our own dialogue and within our teams. And let me add some important things. I think this is very important if you're a listener. Before we get into this episode, we want to let you know that this episode is just a small part of a much larger project between Barna and Aspen to do with this subject and topic. So be sure to check out our Making Space journal series, journal 1 titled Making Space for Inspiration. How great is that? It's out now. So to order it, go to barna.com/making space, or you can subscribe to Barna Access Plus, get immediate access to the journal right now. So today's conversation is going to be fantastic. And again, Jay, I'm really looking forward to our guest today.
Yeah, me too. So let's get to it. Today, we have the great privilege of speaking with Tish Harrison Warren. Many of you know her. She is a priest in the Anglican Church of North America. She's an award-winning writer. Her writing is truly prolific. The author of Liturgy of the Ordinary, which had profound impact on me, as well as another book, Prayer in the Night, which is a more recent book. She's also, many of you read her in the New York Times and Christianity Today and all over the place. And so, we're so excited to jump into this conversation. Tish, thank you so much for jumping on with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I want to begin with a very big overarching question, and you're going to want to go 2 hours on this, but as succinctly but as in-depth as possible. I just want to ask you, how would you define spiritual formation?
Yeah, I would want to go 2 hours on that. God help me to do this succinctly. Spiritual formation. So when we're talking about formation, we're talking about who the people that we are, or the people we're becoming. How do you form human beings? And the way that Andy Crouch, I think I'm going to get this a little bit wrong, but he defines human beings in his most recent book, The Life We're Longing For, as heart, soul, mind, strength complexes that are made for love and worship and community. And so because of that, spiritual formation is dealing with heart, soul, mind, and strength, which is our beliefs, our minds, our doctrine, our dogmas, and that is not just for Christians, that's the things, even if you don't think you believe in doctrine, you do. I mean, you have assumptions about what human beings are, what we're for, whether or not there's a God, if God is he, she, or it could be known. But also our emotions, our inner life, our what the church fathers would refer to as our passions, the things that are our deepest motivations of our soul, and also our bodies, how we use our bodies, how we think of our bodies, how we treat our bodies and other people's bodies, so heart, mind, soul, and strength, our will, our the kind of parts of us that we feel like are most ourselves, our most kind of spiritual longings and questions. So all that to say is spiritual formation is dealing with orthodoxy is the way the church right beliefs, orthopraxis or praxi, which is right action, and then orthopathy, right feelings or right emotions. And so formation is how do we form those things? How do we shape those so that we live in truth in what we believe, in our inner life, what we feel or what our motivations are, and in our active life, what we do.
Yeah. Super helpful.
That's so nice. You know, Tish, I love that answer. And I guess we're investigating, we're examining these threads of connection between that right there, spiritual formation, and of all things, space and places. Barna found for this project, 3 in 10 US adults, so 31%, say they regularly visit a place they'd consider spiritual or transcendent. And I think for me, this speaks to the need for places that bring hope and comfort and belonging. I'd love your thoughts on this. What makes a physical space sacred?
Yeah. So I want to say that I think from almost the history of humanity, the idea that place would matter for us, for the spiritual life, for holism, for the soul, would be such a given. It would be so obvious, I think, to people. It's interesting to me, I think, that it is not now. But I want to say that that's kind of a malformation, or that's something unique about modernity that you would not have seen before modernity. And I think that when we started to think that James K. A. Smith talks about how we began to see sort of human beings as like brains on sticks, right? That what really matters is sort of our thoughts. And so then the outside world it starts to fade. It starts to seem less important. And so you see this even with church buildings moving from beauty to kind of more a utilitarian view. Certainly you see this with architecture moving from sort of design and design for human beings to cities designed for cars, for instance. The that the outside just seems less and less to matter. And then certainly we saw a great jump in this with the advent of the internet, right? Where it seems like materiality is called into question about, does that matter? But even with those shifts, we can't get away from the fact that we are bodies, and human beings are maybe more than bodies, but they're never less than that. And so we are affected by the spaces around us. We have a profound emotional reaction to spaces around us, whether we realize it or not. But I also think spaces around us are formative in the sense that the spaces that we occupy tell us a story about who human beings are and what we exist for. So when I'm in a gym, for instance, that tells me kind of what I am in a way that is different than when I'm in a cathedral, which is different than when I'm in a mall, which is different than when I'm in an office park, right? Or a convenience store. And so all of these are kind of sending me different messages that your primary identity in this space is a consumer, or your primary identity in this space is someone that, is a weight gainer or weight loser, in a gym, or your primary identity in this space is as a worshiper. So I think, what was your original question?
Well, let me ask this. Let me ask this, then, Tish. What if?
Sacred?
Well, if that's the case, what kind of identity do you think are modern day church facilities? For example, we're talking about a subject that has broader implications. But what kind of identity do you think that our modern day church environments are communicating?
Well, it depends on the church. And it depends on the space, right? So I think it's difficult to when you think about kind of what makes a space sacred. Some of that is it's hard to talk about in the sense that I do think there is a sacramentality, is the way Anglicans would talk about this, to all of life. And so when we go to some gorgeous place of beauty, it could be a city park or it could be the Grand Canyon. I think that it's in those spaces we naturally have kind of a transcendent experience. When I go to the beach, when I go to the seashore, I have a transcendent experience. Some of that is because we understand, Anglicans would understand all of nature, natural beauty, to be sacramental. And by sacramental, I mean that we believe that the stuff of heaven, eternal things, God, is encountered through the stuff of earth, right? Through material things, through bread and wine for the actual sacraments, but through what we don't mean that everything is a sacrament, but we do mean that through things like trees and rocks and skin and food, we encounter something divine. We encounter transcendence in that. But when we talk about the built environment, things like church buildings, or malls, or the house I'm in, some of that, I think, understanding of sacred space is a place that is specifically set apart for worship and set apart for God. So that could look like a church. That could look like a space that you use for worship that you have kind of intentionally curated in your own home as a place of prayer, or a prayer garden or something like that. But I think for churches, what's interesting is that for a long time, particularly in the 20th century and 21st century, some churches, particularly evangelical churches, have adopted an idea that it doesn't matter, that space doesn't matter, that what matters is the ideas communicated in this space. But they fail to see that the space actually communicates tons of content and ideas, tons of kind of latent beliefs about who we are as people. And so churches that come to look like office parks, for instance, are saying that what's happening in this space is transactional, because that's what happens in office parks, right? Business. That we're here for some sort of transaction, right? Or that we're here for some sort of work. Or a place that looks like a rock concert is that we're here for some kind of experience of entertainment, or even a particular emotional experience, I think. So if our churches are made to look like TED Talks with a great rock concert to begin with, it communicates that what we're there for is to hear a good stimulating talk and have a particular experience, a sort of emotional experience or whatever you would have like a great rock show, versus like ancient cathedrals, which are made to make you feel small. They're made to communicate the gospel to pre-literate people, to people who can't read, because you're surrounded by stories of scripture. Or I said, even like it doesn't have to be a soaring cathedral, like a old Puritan church is much more simple. It's much more whitewashed, but it's meant to humble you. Like that's part of that. And then they have this, the highest point in the room is the pulpit because they want you to physically experience that the word of God is above you, that it is more powerful than you, that it's not about, it's not that you're small and the word of God is like comes to us, right? And so, my own church, it's not, I mean, my own church building on Sunday is not in itself a beautiful space. It's, we rent it and share it with a school. So it's not a transcendent space, but the congregation and church leaders have done an excellent job of bringing beauty, of recreating that space, bringing beauty into it through icons. We have kneelers with candles on them that are surrounding the. So every place I look, you can kneel and pray. And so, for instance, my kids, almost every week, my 9-year-old kneels at the kneeler and lights a candle. And there's icons all around her. So she's learning about prayer. She's learning about different ways to kind of understand and worship Jesus through the physical space that she's in. Not necessarily because there was a sermon on prayer, but because the designed space, the kneeler, invites her to kneel and to light a candle. I mean, it is, when you have kneelers all around you, it's easier to kneel and pray.
Yeah, that's so good. There's so much good. I mean, early on, you got into sacramental theology in a way that I think is really accessible for many of our listeners who maybe aren't super familiar. I love some of the, you mentioned James K. Smith. He's got this wonderful thing he does about how the American shopping mall, you mentioned the mall,
Right.
how even
Yeah.
the shopping mall is sort of pursuing transcendence in a subtle way, sort of aspiring to gain our allegiance. And yeah, I love that thought that in a cathedral, we feel small. It's almost as if on this podcast, as we're constantly exploring the idea of space, space reminds us that we're not the center of the universe in many ways, and it postures us in a particular way. Some of the research actually that Barna and Aspen Group have done around this, Christians say, like 80% of Christians say that they actually find, Christian churches and cathedrals, Christian churches about 80% and cathedrals about 66% say that they find them as utterly transcendent spaces. But what was really fascinating is a lot of Christians also said that they find other spaces transcendent. So 72%, you mentioned nature, 72% of Christians say nature is a transcendent space. 58% say they've actually crafted a space in their own home that feels transcendent. And actually 51%, so over half, just find their homes in general as transcendent spaces. And Tish, you've done a lot of writing and thinking, an entire book, The Liturgy of the Ordinary. Talk to us a little bit about how everyday habits, ordinary, or at least air quote, ordinary mundane spaces can be really transcendent and then therefore formational for us.
Yeah. I do think in my book, Liturgy of the Ordinary, I have a whole book on this. So so read that. It's hard to sum up, but I do think that we are formed by what we do. We're formed by what we believe, but we're formed a lot through practices, through what we do. So, for instance, when I pick up my smartphone, I don't have to say, I believe that Apple is the creator of heaven and earth, that Steve Jobs is the author and perfecter of my faith. But if I'm constantly, if an alien descended and looked at my life, they would say, oh, this is my God. This is what I consult the most in a day is the smartphone. This is what I, not anymore, but at one point in my life, this is what I woke up with and this is what I went to sleep with, right? And so so that shaped me in a way that I wouldn't necessarily consciously have to think about. And so in the same way, what we do in our daily life, what our practices are, what we do with our bodies, the way we relate to other people, form us and shape us. It shapes who we are. It shapes how we understand the world. And so our daily life is the very place of our formation. And so the spaces that we occupy in that and what they look like and how we keep up with them form us and shape us. All of us know this in some ways. I mean, our house is way too messy, right? And so, but because of that, and I'm not one of those like Christian influencers that is like, my house is so messy, but it looks like Instagram, like mine's actually messy. And so it looks, but just being in that space raises chaos, raises our sort of sense of being frazzled in a way that is different than if I'm in a space that is much more minimalistic or much more beautiful. Like for better or worse, we just can't get away from the fact that we are embodied creatures that are deeply shaped by our environments and in ways that we don't even know, taking in information at every moment. I mean, and this looks like even in small ways, right? Like when our air condition broke a few weeks ago and I'm in Texas, it was very, very hot. And all of a sudden, everyone in my home became much more angry, much less kind to each other. So is it that we are like deeply sanctified people and suddenly the sanctification went away, like the holiness went away? No, it's that we were hot. And what we take as sanctification oftentimes is comfort, that we're comfortable, right? And so our physical space, the heat of our physical space shaped our shaped our interactions in ways that they were formative to us as a family, right? And so the places and spaces that you occupy shape us. I mean, we aren't Gnostic. Like we believe that our bodies matter, and you can't believe a body matters without believing a space matters, because bodies only exist in spaces.
Wow, what profound thoughts. As we are wrapping up today, Tish, speak to the leader who's listening. I know in the Liturgy of the Ordinary, brilliant. Also helped me learn about the Anglican tradition, but you really do help bring about meaning at a spiritual level from the things that we often overlooked. And I think often we have overlooked facilities and space, and they can so easily become just functional. I mean, just get things done, and we don't see the sacred in that. We don't see the meaning. So, to the pastor, to the leader, spiritual formation, space and place, just what would be some closing thoughts on helping make this practical for us?
Yeah. Well, a few things. I think what we're doing as pastors, and I am a pastor, and so I can speak even out of my own experience, is we are seeking to help be part of forming a community gathered around word and sacrament that is a community of worshipers, right? That people understand themselves primarily as, like I said, these heart, soul, strength, mind complexes made for worship, right? And so, because of that, I think we need to be intentional about having a space that is made for worship, so that even if the pastor didn't get up and say anything at all, that the space itself is communicating something already. And I'm certainly for pastors having great sermons, but that even if, you got laryngitis and couldn't, that the space itself would draw us to God. So part of that is beauty. Just care about physical beauty. I think we're made for truth, beauty, and goodness. And so people respond to beauty. But also, I think particularly in America, I mean, something that I worry about is that almost every single one of our public spaces is shaped by capitalism and shaped by an exchange of things, so that it either looks like an office or a Starbucks or a mall, like a place where that is first and foremost about financial transaction. And I think what I worry about is, particularly in urban areas, as churches are shutting down and becoming cool bars or apartment buildings or that sort of thing, that we're literally losing spaces that are both that are transcendent and that are free to enter. Because it's different than something like an art museum, which is typically not open to the public for free. So I think we need a recovery of sacred space. Some of that is beauty. I think a lot of that is intentionally setting aside space for worship, for God. Intentionally setting aside space for prayer is what a lot of that looks like. So we need physical ways that people can kneel and pray. We need quiet, for instance, or we need, it helps to have art, that tells the story of the gospel, or that draws us to that which is outside of ourselves, that which is transcendent. Another thing is that this is very like Anglican of me, but I have to say it, is that we don't have to come up with this. Like, humans have been worshiping for thousands of years, and there are some like very good like things that last for thousands of years typically last because they're good for human beings, and humans naturally respond to them. So one of the things that Stanley Hauerwas, the theologian, says about evangelicals is that part of the problem with evangelicalism is that we feel like we have to reinvent the wheel. We have to make everything ourselves. And because of that, it gets lost and sort of it falters by its own exhaustion, right? And so we don't have to come up with, well, how should a worship space look from scratch? I think that we look at how worship spaces have looked. And I understand there's a lot of different traditions here. A Catholic church is going to look different than an Orthodox church, which will look different than like a Reformed kind of Puritan church, which will look different than, kind of like an old cathedral versus sort of like go to a Baptist church even from Spurgeon's time. So I get that things look different in these spaces. But some of the things that, well, first of all, is know your own tradition and why the space looks like what it does. Like, for instance, in old Anglican churches, they intentionally put the baptismal font, they connected it physically to the pulpit. They were part of the same piece of kind of liturgical furniture. And they did that to say you can't disconnect baptism, the sacrament, from the word, the pulpit. And so this was this physical way of talking about theology, of talking about how we hold together scripture and sacrament. So know your own tradition, know why church buildings have looked like they have. And if you're not from a tradition, you're just like, we're non-denominational, then look at other traditions. Learn why they look like they do. Start to think about church architecture, or I would even say not just church architecture, but architecture itself, theologically. This isn't just some weird, separate discipline that has nothing to do with theology. This is like theologically laden in the way that we think about design and space. And so begin to sort of explore that, to read about that, to think about that. And certainly know that every single symbol, every single corner of your sanctuary is communicating something. So be thoughtful about what it is communicating.
Yeah, that's such a good word, really convicting, but encouraging at the same time for church leaders. For church leaders like me, and Benjamin led a church for a very long time. And thank you so much, Tish, for the entire conversation. As always, it was that perfect mix of your depth and wisdom and insight, and yet really accessible, really encouraging. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me.
Well, Tish, thank you. Jay, I called it up front. Super interesting conversation. So much to unpack there. What's something that just impacted you about that conversation?
Yeah, so much there. In a weird way, I was so like gut punch convicted when Tish was talking about how not just the physical space, but how we fill the physical space of our church gatherings communicate something. It made me think of that really famous line from Marshall McLuhan when he says, "The medium is the message." What we're communicating isn't just the stuff we say, it's the space we create, the environment we curate. And so, yeah, I mean, the volume of our music, the way the lights shine or don't shine in the room, it all says to our people who they're supposed to be in that room. Are they supposed to be an audience or a congregation? Yeah, there was a lot there, and I'm just so grateful because I think it's both. There's that depth of thought that Tish always brings, and then some practical, maybe even convicting applications that we might need to consider. What about you, Benjamin?
It certainly makes me think more about cathedrals and church history with architecture. I think in our modern day church, it can be very easy, especially in my stream, that again, church facilities become, they're functional. And to learn more about some of the built-in theology to church architecture and furnishings in cathedrals, to me, that's very fascinating. I love the idea that cathedrals were built to make you feel small. And so I think there's a lot that the modern day church could learn by looking back when it comes to church design, church buildings, and church spaces. There's a lot of meaning there.
Yeah, absolutely. Agreed. Hey, we just want to remind you guys, if this is helpful conversation to you, if it's interesting or convicting or anything like that, Benjamin mentioned it at the top, but our first journal, along with this podcast series, Making Space for Inspiration, it's available to you. Just go to barna.com/making space and subscribe to Barna Access Plus, and you'll get immediate access to the journal. And we want to say thank you guys for listening. We are a new podcast, so if you've been encouraged or convicted or challenged, share the episode around, share the podcast, go online, give us a review, and we are, again, so grateful you're joining us, and we're cheering you on as you serve and lead your congregations, and we will talk to you all very soon.